The tires of Grace Williams' forest green Chevrolet Cavalier hissed across the icy streets of Brightmoor, Detroit, as the December wind bit through her coat. At 8:47 p.m., she held the phone to her ear, her voice bright with excitement. "Marcus," she said, breath visible in the cold. Tommy just read his first full sentence. You should have seen his face. "I'll be home in 20 minutes. Don't let the dinner get cold." A laugh escaped her lips, nervous yet warm, a sound Marcus had memorized. Outside, headlights glinted off frozen puddles, the streets empty, silent but for the hum of the heater and distant barking dogs. Grace gripped the steering wheel tighter, a shiver running through her. She turned onto Lasser Road, unaware that a dark van had begun tailing her, its shape blotting out the dim streetlights. Her heart lifted at the thought of sharing the day's triumphs with Marcus. She adjusted the rearview mirror, catching only fleeting glimpses of the van behind her. It was close now. Too close. And then the world narrowed. A sharp swerve to avoid black ice, a muffled scream of tires scraping metal, and Grace was gone from the familiar route she'd taken countless times before. Before we continue, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. 3 days later, the forest green Cavalier sat in the deserted parking lot of an abandoned automotive plant on 8 Mile Road. Its driver's side door swung loosely in the wind, keys still dangling in the ignition. Grace's purse lay untouched on the passenger seat. Her wallet, with $23 folded neatly inside, was exactly as she had left it. The janitor who stumbled upon the vehicle squinted at the frost-glazed windows. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the absence of Grace screamed louder than any sound. A bolt of unease rippled through him as he noticed the door's angle and the frozen layer of snow on the driver's floor mat. Questions multiplied in the chill. Did she park here willingly? Had she met someone she knew? Or had someone forced her into the shadows of the night? Detectives arriving on the scene noted the odd precision. No signs of a struggle inside the car, no fingerprints beyond her own. It was as though she had evaporated into the December air. This abandoned lot, the forgotten industrial sprawl, held only her empty car and the first hints of the nightmare that would grip her family for decades. Back in a small apartment near Woodward Avenue, Marcus Holloway paced the living room floor. His hands shook, phone cradled as he dialed every hospital, police station, and neighbor he could think of. Each unanswered ring, each voicemail, pushed panic further into his chest. The pot roast sat cold on the kitchen counter, a silent testament to the night's interrupted routine. Grace's mother, Eleanor Williams, hovered by the doorway, clutching her apron, eyes wide and uncomprehending. "Maybe she's just stuck in traffic," she whispered, though even she could hear the tremor in her own voice. Marcus shook his head, the fear crawling up his throat. 3 days, he muttered. She's been gone for 3 days. The silence in the apartment was suffocating. Every phone ring made them jump. Every distant siren sounded like a mockery. They could not imagine the horrors Grace might have faced, the terror in those final hours, the moments of helplessness that would stretch into a lifetime of grief. Their world had frozen, just like the streets outside, as a chilling truth began to settle. Grace was gone, and someone had taken her. Detectives combed through the scene, examining tire tracks half hidden in ice and the footprints leading to and from the abandoned plant. 2 witnesses emerged, a night shift worker, Douglas Perth, and a teenager, Kevin Tatum, who recalled a dark panel van trailing Grace's car for blocks. Neither could explain why it had been there, who had been inside, or how it seemed to vanish along with her. For decades, the answers remained out of reach. Grace had witnessed something she should not have, a fact unknown at the time but central to the crime. The person responsible walked freely, blending seamlessly into the community. Friends, neighbors, even those who mourned her publicly, had no idea that the true culprit was only a few streets away. Can you imagine if this happened to someone you loved and you didn't even know? Or risk missing the truth that could haunt you forever? If you won't subscribe, leave a comment telling us why you'd rather live unaware. Grace Williams was born on the 14th of March, 1959, in Detroit, Michigan, the eldest of two children in a tight-knit family. Her parents, Eleanor and Thomas Williams, had moved to Brightmoor decades earlier, seeking steady work and a safe place to raise their children. Grace's younger sister, Patricia, was 3 years her junior, and from the very beginning, the two shared a bond that could withstand any quarrel or distance. In the small family home, laughter was constant, echoing off the narrow hallways and wooden floors. Birthdays were celebrated with homemade cakes, evenings were spent sharing stories around the kitchen table, and even the winter chill never dampened their closeness. From childhood, Grace displayed a natural warmth and empathy that drew people in. Neighbors remembered her offering to carry groceries for elderly residents, lending a hand without being asked, and greeting everyone on the block by name. Her parents instilled in her a sense of responsibility and compassion, but it was her own spirit that made her presence so unforgettable. Thomas often joked that Grace could light up a whole room without turning a single switch on, and Eleanor would laugh, adding, "And she did it every day," without even realizing it. Detroit shaped Grace just as much as she shaped it. She knew the streets, the local markets, the community parks where she had played as a child. The city's frozen winters were no obstacle. The scent of hot cocoa from neighborhood diners and the warmth of family homes created a sense of comfort that Grace carried into adulthood. Every visit to her parents' house was filled with hugs, stories, and small acts of care, checking on Patricia's homework, reminding neighbors of appointments, or simply offering a smile to anyone who needed it. Her family was her anchor, and they were proud of the woman she had become, kind, intelligent, and unafraid to extend herself for others. This was the Grace Williams everyone knew, the light that would make her disappearance that much harder to bear. The audience begins to understand that the loss was not just of a teacher, a volunteer, or a friend, but of a daughter, a sister, a source of warmth and love whose absence would leave a permanent void. Grace Williams had a way of making learning feel like an adventure. As a 5-year-old elementary school teacher at Riverside Elementary, she was known not just for her knowledge, but for the warmth she brought to every lesson. The classroom buzzed with the faint smell of crayons, freshly sharpened pencils, and the worn pages of storybooks she had collected over the years. Children's laughter bounced off the walls as Grace moved from desk to desk, kneeling beside students struggling with reading, her voice patient yet encouraging. Every child felt seen by Grace. She celebrated their small victories with genuine excitement, whether it was mastering a sentence, solving a tricky math problem, or simply trying again after a mistake. "You can do it, Tommy," she would say, her voice soft but firm. "I know you can read that sentence aloud." When the words came together for her students, her face lit up in the same way it did when she spoke to Marcus on the phone, a radiant smile that made every achievement feel monumental. Grace didn't limit her support to school hours. She stayed late, with her own way, some of her, with her tan skin, helping students who struggled to catch up, sometimes bringing homemade cookies for encouragement. Parents noted her dedication, the way she remembered every student's name, every challenge they faced, and every dream they held. She knew that each child's success was intertwined with patience, care, and persistence, and she embodied all three effortlessly. Her impact extended beyond academics. Grace nurtured confidence, resilience, and joy in her students. They trusted her, confided in her, and relied on her guidance. To the community, she was not just a teacher, she was a beacon, a young woman whose energy and kindness radiated far beyond the classroom walls. In these moments, the audience begins to grasp the depth of what would be lost with her disappearance, not just a life, but the countless lives she touched, shaped, and inspired. Outside the classroom, Grace Williams devoted herself to the Brightmoor community with the same passion and care she brought to teaching. Twice a week, she volunteered at St. Michael's Community Center, running literacy programs for immigrant families who struggled with English. The center's hallways echoed with her laughter as she guided parents and children through reading exercises, explaining words with patience and encouragement. The smell of books mixed with the faint aroma of cocoa and freshly baked cookies she often brought, creating a comforting space for those who needed it most. Grace's generosity extended beyond lessons. She organized community events, from bake sales to small fundraisers, ensuring every detail served a purpose, helping families, celebrating children's achievements, and building bonds in a neighborhood that had seen hardship. She could often be found kneeling to tie a child's shoelace, listening intently to someone's worries, or offering advice with quiet reassurance. Her efforts went unnoticed by some, but for those who experienced her care firsthand, Grace was a symbol of hope and kindness. Neighbors remembered her knocking on doors with invitations to community potlucks, attending local church events, or coaching youth baseball alongside fathers and older teens. She wasn't seeking recognition. She simply wanted to contribute meaningfully. Her presence brought warmth and energy to spaces that often felt cold and unforgiving. For the audience, these details underscore the depth of Grace's character. She was a young woman who gave freely, touched countless lives, and made her community a better place. Her disappearance would leave a void, not only in the homes of those she loved, but also in the streets, halls, and hearts of the people who depended on her light, making the stakes of her story profoundly personal. Grace Williams had a vision for her life that went far beyond teaching and volunteering. She dreamed of marriage, son, senses, planning a June wedding with Marcus Holloway, the man who had been by her side through college, late-night study sessions, and the first steps of her teaching career. Their apartment was modest but filled with laughter, shared stories, and little plans for the future, a life built on trust, love, and the small joys that make ordinary days extraordinary. On the evening of December 18th, 1984, Grace had called Marcus with excitement, telling him about a student who had just mastered reading a full sentence. Her voice carried pride, warmth, and the subtle thrill of accomplishment. "I'll be home in 20 minutes, she promised, unaware that those would be her last words to him. In the kitchen, her mother's pot roast sat cooling, and the mundane comfort of a family dinner awaited her return. Every moment of that evening reflected the life she had worked to build a life filled with hope, care, and connection. Grace had spent the day nurturing young minds, supporting families in need, and envisioning a future full of love and laughter. The audience now understands not just what was taken, but the breadth of it. A woman whose presence made others better, whose dreams were bright, and whose loss would leave enduring pain. These last happy moments anchor the story emotionally. They show the audience precisely what vanished on that icy December night, setting the stakes high for the investigation to follow. The clock struck 8:40 p.m. at St. Michael's Community Center, and Grace Williams gathered her things after a long evening guiding parents and children through reading lessons. The faint hum of the heaters mingled with the scent of old books and the lingering aroma of cocoa from earlier in the evening. She smiled at the group of students lingering near the door, their eyes bright with excitement over the sentences they had learned that night. "See you next week," Grace said, her voice warm, genuine, carrying the gentle rhythm that had calmed anxious children for years. She waved goodbye to her colleagues, each wave a small gesture of encouragement and shared accomplishment. The janitor offered a tired smile, noticing the sparkle of satisfaction in her eyes. For Grace, these moments were ordinary, yet each small interaction was layered with the quiet devotion she felt toward the community she served. Stepping outside, the icy December air hit her sharply. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees, and frost glittered on the ground like scattered glass. She adjusted her scarf, tucked her gloves into her coat pocket, and made her way to her forest green Chevrolet Cavalier. Footsteps crunched against the frozen pavement, blending with the distant wail of a police siren far down the street and the faint hum of engines from passing vehicles. Grace had no inkling that this night would become a permanent fracture in the lives of those she loved. The chill of the winter evening, the dim glow of street lamps reflecting off slick ice, and the ordinary quiet of the neighborhood masked the shadow that had begun to trail her. At that very moment, an unseen presence started following her routine, moving silently, observing, waiting for her next turn. Grace slid into her forest green Chevrolet Cavalier, the cold seeping through the car doors, biting at her fingers as she started the ignition. The hum of the engine filled the silent night. Streets glistened with ice, and the reflection of streetlights danced like ghostly figures across the frozen asphalt. She adjusted the rearview mirror, smiled at the thought of telling Marcus about the student who had finally read a full sentence, and pulled onto the road leading home. Douglas Perth, a night shift worker fueling his truck 2 blocks away, noticed her car pass by. Something made him pause a van, dark and paneled, trailing Grace's Cavalier for several blocks. It moved without its lights on, a shadow gliding along the icy roads. He squinted, heart thumping, unsure if he was seeing correctly, then watched as the vehicles disappeared from view. A teenager, Kevin Tatum, riding his bike along a nearby street, saw the van too. He remembered the primer spots on the driver's side door and the way it seemed to mirror every turn Grace's car took. A cold shiver ran down his spine, and he pedaled faster, feeling an inexplicable unease settle over the neighborhood. Grace, immersed in her thoughts and unaware of the danger following her, hummed softly to herself. Her tires crunched over the frozen slush, each sound magnified in the quiet night. The van stayed close, yet she remained oblivious to the presence that had begun to shadow her every move. The audience can now sense the imminent threat, the combination of icy streets, dwindling streetlights, and an unknown observer following silently. Grace's routine drive home, so ordinary and familiar, had become the start of a nightmare that would stretch over 4 decades, leaving families shattered and a community in disbelief. Grace's Cavalier wound through the dim streets of Brightmoor, the cold night pressing in from all sides. Snow and ice glittered under the streetlights, their weak illumination casting long streaks across the frozen pavement. Her mind replayed the student's triumphant smile, the warm words of thanks from parents, and the fleeting plans she had made with Marcus. Every turn, every quiet block, felt familiar and safe until it wasn't. Unseen by Grace, the dark panel van mirrored her every move. Its engine hummed low, almost silent against the backdrop of the sleeping neighborhood. The tires of the van whispered over ice, staying precisely at her rear, keeping pace through the desolate streets. Kevin Tatum had already long gone, yet the image of that van haunted him. The way it seemed to know her route, the way it followed without hesitation, leaving him unsettled for days afterward. As Grace's car turned onto smaller side streets, the emptiness around her deepened. Houses sat dark, frost rimmed the windows, and the occasional sound of a loose shutter in the wind punctuated the silence. The van remained behind, its presence unnoticed, yet it carried the weight of imminent danger. Each second stretched, the distance between Grace and safety growing with every icy turn. Her ordinary drive home, a ritual repeated countless times, was now a corridor lined with uncertainty. The audience senses that the invisible threat is closing in, a silent predator in the night. Grace's innocence and routine had unknowingly drawn attention, and with every street she passed, the potential for catastrophe increased. Think about someone vanishing into the night, and nobody notices until it's too late. Don't risk staying uninformed. Subscribe now to follow every detail, or tell us in the comments why you wouldn't want to know the truth. The call came in on a cold December night. Detective Frank Kozlowski, 20 years into a career that had seen every shade of human cruelty, felt a familiar weight settle in his chest as he read the report. Grace Williams, 25, missing from Brightmoor. He rubbed his temples, the lines under his eyes deepening. Aware that Detroit's crime statistics that year were unforgiving, 43 missing persons in a single month, resources stretched thin, and a city teetering under the weight of its own troubles. Yet this case, something about it pulled him in. Kozlowski arrived at St. Michael's Community Center, notebooks and forms ready, breath clouding the frigid air. He spoke with colleagues, taking careful notes about Grace's routines, her warmth with students, and the last moments she was seen. Every gesture, every word mattered. His mind raced. A teacher, a volunteer, a young woman filled with life, suddenly gone. The frustration of a city overrun with cases, combined with his personal drive, ignited a sense of urgency. He organized his team methodically, assigning interviews and evidence collection. Officers were dispatched to canvass nearby streets, noting the frozen roads and dim streetlights that masked any observer's movements. Kozlowski reviewed past abduction cases, any pattern that might guide him. Detroit's winter nights were treacherous, each icy block a potential hiding place for a predator. He felt the tension in the air not just from the elements, but from the invisible threat lurking somewhere in the neighborhood. Resources were limited. Labs were backlogged, and forensic science was rudimentary. Yet Kozlowski refused to let that deter him. Every lead mattered. A janitor's account, a gas station attendant's vague observation, any detail that could point to Grace's location. He worked late into the night, his coat dusted with snow, eyes scanning maps of the community center. The streets, the areas where Grace could have gone. Each step, each note, each call to a witness built the framework for a search that could mean life or death. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, Kozlowski's focus never wavered. He understood the stakes not just for Grace, but for every family watching and praying for answers in a city that often gave none. Detective Kozlowski moved quickly, knowing every hour counted. He began with the familiar faces at St. Michael's Community Center. Teachers, volunteers, and staff spoke of Grace Williams with warmth and reverence. They recalled her laughter echoing through the classrooms, the way she stayed late to tutor struggling students, and the small, thoughtful gestures, cookies baked for parents, handwritten notes of encouragement. Every detail painted a picture of a life devoted to others, a life abruptly interrupted. Neighbors provided further pieces of the puzzle. Some had seen her car leaving the center, headlights cutting through the icy night. One recalled a dark van that seemed to trail her closely, its outline almost hidden in the shadows. The memory, initially dismissed, became significant. The vehicle's primer spots and absence of lights suggested intention, not coincidence. Kevin Tatum, a teenager riding nearby, added his observation of the van, describing the way it mirrored Grace's turns, as if she were being watched with careful precision. Kozlowski compiled the accounts, noting consistencies and discrepancies, his mind mapping possible routes and motives. He realized the van could be key, a mobile witness, an ominous shadow in a city of many. With thousands of panel vans registered in Detroit, the task seemed impossible. Still, Kozlowski remained methodical, tracking owners, interviewing mechanics, and contacting scrapyard operators, each call a potential breakthrough. Every interaction carried emotional weight. Colleagues whispered of Grace's excitement earlier that night. Neighbors admitted to passing her car without thinking twice, unaware that a life hung in the balance. Kozlowski felt the urgency in each statement, the silent plea for him to uncover the truth. The pieces were small, fragmented, but together they hinted at a deliberate pursuit, a shadowy presence linked to Grace's final moments. The audience senses the growing tension, the invisible force closing in, the city's cold streets acting as both barrier and witness. The investigation was underway, but answers were still out of reach, leaving hope fragile and the threat palpable. Detective Kozlowski spread maps across the table, pins and markers highlighting every place Grace Williams had been that evening. The community center, where her voice had carried warmth and laughter, the abandoned automotive plant where her car would later be found, and the remote corners of Rouge Park, all points forming a triangle, each one a clue to her unseen journey. Every line, every intersection, suggested a mind at work, someone familiar with the city's industrial veins. He considered the pattern carefully. The locations weren't random: the abandoned plant, the rarely patrolled streets, the back roads leading to the park. These were places where few would venture, where someone could act without drawing attention. It spoke of knowledge, a deliberate choice to exploit blind spots in the city's watchful eyes. Kozlowski imagined Grace turning each corner, unaware of the unseen eyes tracking her movements, and a chill ran deeper than the December cold. The detective cross-referenced witness statements. Noting the dark van that had mirrored her every turn, he charted its reported route, overlaying it with the locations of abandoned lots, industrial yards, and potential hiding places. Even with limited 1,984 technology, Kozlowski's methodical approach revealed patterns. The city's sprawling industrial zones weren't just concrete and steel, they were a map of opportunity for those who knew them well. Every discarded lead, every shadowed alleyway was weighed against the possibility of finding Grace alive. Kozlowski knew that understanding the geography could uncover the mindset of her abductor, a theory he could refine only by painstakingly connecting the dots. The audience begins to grasp the magnitude of the challenge. A young woman's life vanished into a landscape designed for secrecy. As the pins formed a geometric outline of danger, Kozlowski felt the mounting tension pressing in. The city itself seemed complicit in her disappearance, its frozen streets and empty lots echoing the silent threat stalking her. The investigation was no longer just about leads, it was about decoding a predator's familiarity with his surroundings. Every moment, every movement, mattered. Despite hours of meticulous work, Detective Kozlowski and his team kept hitting walls. The city offered no easy answers. Witness accounts were limited, details faded in the cold December air, and the dark van seemed to have disappeared as quickly as Grace herself. For every lead followed, a dozen more dissolved into dead ends. Each failed avenue deepened the frustration, leaving the detectives grasping for fragments of a case that refused to yield. Forensics in 1984 were rudimentary. Evidence collected from the community center, the abandoned plant, and city streets could only offer so much. Fibers, fingerprints, tire tracks, each was examined, catalogued, and cross-referenced, yet nothing definitively pointed to a suspect. Kozlowski understood the limits of technology. The slow pace of lab work and the frustration of knowing the truth lay just beyond reach. Every day that passed, without progress, was another day. Grace remained missing. Another day, her family suffered in uncertainty. The personal toll was heavy. Kozlowski often stayed late, tracing routes on city maps, making countless calls, reviewing statements, unable to switch off the gnawing tension. The family's anxiety added weight to the investigation. Each conversation with Marcus Holloway or Patricia Williams Bennett reminded him of the stakes. The clock was relentless, the winter cold, unforgiving, and the sense of helplessness gnawed at even the most experienced detective. Community pressure intensified. Rumors spread, neighbors speculated, and media coverage painted the case as yet another lost soul in Detroit's harsh landscape. Kozlowski felt the collective frustration of a city watching silently, wondering if justice would ever arrive. The audience senses the emotional strain, the helplessness, the uncertainty, the pressure mounting on those determined to find answers. Yet through every obstacle, Kozlowski's resolve remained unbroken. He knew the case demanded patience, precision, and unyielding focus. The frustration fueled him, each setback sharpening his determination to uncover the truth. Grace Williams's life and the promise of justice depended on it. January 9th, 1985, dawned cold and gray over Detroit. Rouge Park, still dusted with winter snow, was a playground for neighborhood children, their laughter echoing across the frozen fields. Two boys, bundled in coats and scarves, raced their sleds down a gentle slope near a creek bed. What began as a typical morning of childhood adventure turned into a scene that would haunt them forever. One of the boys, Jamie Sanders, noticed a dark shape protruding from the snow near the creek. Curious, he trudged closer, snow crunching beneath his boots, until he realized it wasn't a branch or discarded debris. His breath caught in shock. The shape resolved into a human figure, clothing stiff with frost. Panic surged as both boys ran to fetch help, shouting for any adult nearby. Officers arrived quickly, cordoning the area as Detective Kozlowski was notified. The moment he saw the body, a heavy silence enveloped the team. Grace Williams, the young teacher missing for 3 weeks, lay partially buried under a tangle of branches and construction debris. Her forest green coat, once vibrant, was dulled by snow and grime. Kozlowski's stomach tightened, knowing the childlike discovery had transformed into grim confirmation of the city's darkest fears. The community reeled at the news. Parents whispered warnings to their children, neighbors huddled together in disbelief, and local media reported the tragedy. For Marcus Holloway, the confirmation was a blow so deep it left him speechless, staring at the photographs of the site, struggling to reconcile the warmth of the woman he loved with the cold finality of her death. Patricia Williams Bennett's grief hardened into resolve, the realization that justice would require decades of perseverance taking root in her heart. The discovery shocked the city, but the case remained constrained by the limitations of 1,985 forensic science. Fibers, traces, and minimal physical evidence hinted at a location where Grace had been held prior to the body being placed in the park, but technology at the time could reveal little more. The medical examiner arrived at Rouge Park shortly after the body was recovered. Dr. Helen Crawford, known for her meticulous attention to detail, worked swiftly yet carefully, documenting every aspect of Grace Williams's condition. The cold had preserved some evidence, but time and exposure had taken their toll. Each movement revealed more about the final hours of the young teacher's life. Dr. Crawford confirmed what the community dreaded. Grace had been strangled. The neck bore unmistakable signs of force, the tension evident even in frozen tissue. No other major trauma was apparent, but subtle abrasions suggested a struggle, corroborating witness speculation that she had fought her abductor. Kozlowski listened, noting every observation, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. Each detail carried implications for both the investigation and for the family desperate for answers. Fibers clinging to her clothing told another story. Industrial carpet fragments, traces of motor oil, and metallic dust indicated she had been held in a location tied to machinery or vehicles before being transported to Rouge Park. Though forensic technology in 1985 could not yet analyze these materials to their full potential, the evidence provided critical leads for the detective. Every fiber hinted at a space only someone familiar with Detroit's industrial zones could access without detection. The emotional impact of the medical report rippled through the city. The knowledge that Grace had been killed deliberately, in a confined space, intensified grief and outrage. Her family struggled to comprehend the cold efficiency with which her life had been ended. For Marcus Holloway and Patricia Williams Bennett, the findings hardened their resolve, confirming that the woman they loved had been silenced by a predator with careful planning and cruel intent. As investigators catalogued the evidence, the enormity of the case became clear. Grace's death was not random. It was a targeted act, one that would haunt Detroit for decades, leaving investigators and the community grappling with both grief and the elusive promise of justice. Word of Grace Williams's death spread quickly, sending shockwaves through Detroit. The Brightmoor neighborhood, already wary during the harsh winter, now carried a collective grief. Parents held their children closer, neighbors whispered warnings about the darkness hidden in familiar streets, and a city already burdened with crime felt a profound sense of loss. Grace's murder became more than a missing person case, it became a symbol of innocence stolen. At home, Marcus Holloway could barely breathe. The pot roast she had promised to eat now sat cold in the kitchen, a cruel reminder of the life that had been so abruptly stolen. Every photograph of Grace seemed to stare back at him, her laughter frozen in time, unreachable. His hands trembled as he touched the items she had left behind, each object now a relic of what had been and what would never be. Patricia Williams Bennett, Grace's younger sister, fought to remain composed. Tears streamed down her face as she confronted the reality that the person she had idolized, the woman who had guided her and inspired countless others, would never return. The grief fueled a fire within her, a determination to seek answers and ensure her sister's story would not fade from memory. The local community grappled with the horror, visiting candlelight vigils and leaving flowers at places Grace had loved. Teachers at Riverside Elementary spoke quietly in staff rooms about the loss of their colleague. Students whispered in hallways, unable to fully comprehend the permanence of death. Every conversation carried undertones of fear and disbelief, as if any ordinary evening could suddenly erupt into tragedy. Detectives, too, felt the weight of this devastation. Kozlowski and his team were reminded that the human cost of unsolved crimes extended far beyond statistics. The loss of Grace Williams was deeply personal for the city. A young life full of promise abruptly ended, leaving behind unanswered questions and a community in mourning. By the mid-1980s, leads on Grace Williams's disappearance had dried up. Despite Detective Kozlowski's relentless efforts, the trail of evidence yielded no suspect. Witnesses could recall only fragments, a van with no headlights, fleeting glimpses of a figure in the shadows, but none could provide the key connection. Police reports accumulated, timelines were charted, and maps were meticulously annotated, yet the case stubbornly resisted resolution. Detroit, already struggling with a surge in crime, offered little reprieve. Officers were pulled to other urgent calls, resources stretched thin, and the public moved on to other headlines. Grace Williams's death, once a central focus for investigators and the community, began to fade into the background of the city's memory. Each unanswered question was a weight, pressing on those still searching for closure. Detective Kozlowski remained committed. Late nights in his office, sifting through files and witness statements, became routine. The frustration of an unsolved murder hung over him like a persistent shadow. He often stared at the map, plotting Grace's last known locations, the community center, the abandoned automotive plant, and Rouge Park, wondering if some minor detail had been overlooked. Yet, the passage of time eroded hope. The official declaration came quietly. The Grace Williams case was cold. No new evidence, no promising leads, no imminent breakthrough. For the family, it was a bitter acknowledgement that the world had moved on while their grief endured. Marcus Holloway continued his life in quiet mourning, his love for Grace untouched, yet marked by the ache of loss. Patricia Williams Bennett's heart burned with a sense of responsibility, a determination to ensure her sister's name would not be forgotten even as years stretched on. The city itself seemed to carry the memory of Grace. Neighborhoods whispered her name, and her absence lingered in conversations about safety, trust, and the fragility of life. The cold case was more than a closed file, it was a wound that refused to heal. For Marcus Holloway, life became a series of quiet, empty nights. The apartment once filled with laughter and the aroma of Grace's cooking now echoed with absence. He never remarried, keeping Grace's photograph on the mantel, a permanent reminder of the life that had been stolen. Her voice, her smile, and her warmth remained vivid in his memory, haunting him daily. Each holiday, each birthday, every milestone Grace would have celebrated, became a stark reminder of the void her death had left. Patricia Williams Bennett carried grief differently. Her sorrow evolved into advocacy, a driving force that channeled her pain into action. She became a beacon for other families trapped in the limbo of unresolved cases, offering guidance, support, and unyielding determination. While the legal system had failed her sister, Patricia refused to surrender to despair. She wrote letters, attended meetings, and pushed for policies to preserve evidence and reopen cold cases, hoping that someday Grace's murderer would be held accountable. The emotional toll extended beyond the immediate family. Neighbors remembered Grace's kindness, her laughter in the hallways, the way she celebrated students' victories, no matter how small. Candlelight vigils and memorials became annual rituals, acts of remembrance to honor her life and keep her story alive. Discussions in the community frequently returned to the chilling question: who had taken her, and why had justice been delayed for so long? Over time, Grace's case became intertwined with local legend. Parents warned children about wandering alone, and whispers of her story circulated in hushed tones. While not supernatural, the haunting presence of her memory shaped the city's collective conscience. Her life and untimely death continued to ripple through generations, reminding everyone that a single act of violence could leave an enduring scar. Over the years, Grace Williams's disappearance took on a quiet, haunting presence within the Brightmoor neighborhood. Children who played near Rouge Park whispered her name, recalling stories of the young teacher who had vanished on a freezing December night. Neighbors would occasionally spot a solitary figure walking along streets she once frequented, the fleeting glimpses sparking rumors, speculation, and unease. Grace's memory became a constant, somber undercurrent in daily life. Local lore grew from fragments of reality. Some recounted seeing her forest green Chevrolet Cavalier parked near the abandoned automotive plant long after it had been retrieved, as though it refused to leave the edges of memory. Others spoke of footsteps near empty playgrounds, or the rustle of leaves where no wind blew. While these tales were never verified, they reflected a community still grappling with the tragedy, attempting to make sense of a life cut short. For residents, Grace's story was both a warning and a moral anchor. Parents reminded their children to be cautious, to trust instincts, and to notice unfamiliar vehicles or strangers in their neighborhoods. Her absence shaped a generation's sense of vigilance, the lingering fear of an unseen threat, a daily reminder that safety could not be taken for granted. Even as years passed, the cold December night of 1984 remained etched in memory. Candlelight vigils continued. Flowers were left at her memorials, and stories of her kindness and dedication to students were recounted with reverence. Grace Williams had left a permanent mark, not just through her life, but through the collective grief and awareness she instilled in a community forced to confront the reality of cruelty and loss. Detective Frank Kozlowski's investigation initially focused on anyone who might have had a connection to Grace Williams or the Brightmoor area. Every lead, however faint, was pursued with painstaking care. Colleagues at the community center, neighbors, and casual acquaintances were interviewed repeatedly, but nothing pointed to a clear suspect. The van, reported by Douglas Perth and Kevin Tatum, remained a central focus, yet tracing it among Detroit's thousands of panel vans proved nearly impossible. Several individuals were questioned extensively, including men who had prior minor offenses in the neighborhood, but each had alibis or no connection to Grace. Each dead end brought rising frustration to the investigative team. Detectives spent long hours combing city records, canvassing industrial zones, and interrogating potential witnesses, only to encounter silence or contradictions. Hours of interviews produced no actionable evidence. For the community, each cleared suspect offered little comfort. Speculation ran rampant. Innocent men found themselves under scrutiny, enduring suspicion and public gossip. The emotional toll extended to Grace's family as well. Patricia and Marcus followed every development closely, hoping for closure that never came. Each false lead added layers of anxiety and despair. Despite the mounting frustration, Kozlowski's team refused to give up. The 1983 attempted abduction near the same community center lingered in his mind. The connection was tenuous, and records were sparse, but the similarity was undeniable. It hinted at someone operating with prior knowledge of the area and its residents, yet no tangible proof emerged. Months passed with nothing but mounting tension. The case's complexity and the sheer number of dead ends weighed heavily on everyone involved. embedding a sense of helplessness and urgency that would follow the investigation for decades. The dark panel van reported by witnesses became the obsession of the investigative team. It was described as a vehicle with primer spots on the driver's side, moving without headlights for blocks, tailing Grace's car with unsettling persistence. Detectives scoured every possible lead: registrations, scrapyards, body shops, and maintenance garages within a 20-mile radius. Each inquiry seemed promising, only to fizzle with dead ends. The van remained invisible, as if it had melted into the night that had swallowed Grace. Kozlowski's frustration grew alongside the team's exhaustion. Days of canvassing neighborhoods yielded only vague recollections, inconsistent sightings, and misremembered details. Witnesses, though sincere, could not provide the precision required to pinpoint the vehicle or its owner. Every new lead seemed to confirm the van's existence while simultaneously proving it untraceable. The emotional strain on Grace's family intensified. Marcus Holloway agonized over the possibility that someone so close to their neighborhood had been responsible, yet remained undetected. Patricia's determination hardened. The sense of helplessness fueled her resolve to ensure her sister would not be forgotten. Each day without answers deepened their grief and frustration. For the detectives, the van represented more than a clue. It symbolized the system's limitations. With no modern technology, no real-time databases, and constrained manpower, the investigation was trapped in an era ill-equipped to solve such a calculated disappearance. Every failed lead, every untraceable sighting, reinforced the bitter reality. Someone with knowledge of Detroit's industrial zones had manipulated the environment to hide their crime. As the investigation stalled, the case became a reminder of how quickly hope could erode, leaving families and communities to grapple with uncertainty and the gnawing fear that justice might never arrive. As weeks turned into months, the weight of the investigation began to press heavily on everyone involved. Detective Kozlowski, known for his relentless dedication, found the case infiltrating every corner of his life. Sleep became irregular, meals were skipped, and the constant frustration of chasing dead ends eroded his morale. Each cleared suspect, each untraceable van sighting, compounded the sense of futility. Even a seasoned investigator like him could feel the gnawing despair that the truth might remain forever out of reach. For Marcus Holloway, the emotional toll was unrelenting. The apartment he once shared with Grace now felt hollow, each room a reminder of a life interrupted. His days became rituals of searching, calling hospitals, checking police reports, and hoping against reason for news that never came. The helplessness was compounded by fear. The terrifying idea that someone dangerous had been walking free all along, possibly watching, waiting. Patricia Williams Bennett carried grief differently, but with equal intensity. Her anger at the seeming ineffectiveness of law enforcement fueled a tireless advocacy for victims' rights. The frustration of watching the case stall while the city's shadows hid a perpetrator left her determined to transform sorrow into action, though each new dead end sharpened the edge of her despair. The community, too, felt the strain. Neighbors wondered if safety had been a mere illusion. Conversations in Brightmoor often returned to the vanished teacher, the van that disappeared, and the cold December night when a life so full of promise ended abruptly. The collective tension detectives stretched thin, family trapped in grief, neighbors unsettled was a reminder of the human cost of unresolved crime. The sense of injustice permeated every action, leaving behind an invisible but heavy weight that would not lift until the case, long dormant, finally found its resolution. While the investigation into Grace Williams' disappearance stalled, a prior case from 1983 quietly resurfaced in Detective Kozlowski's mind. A young woman, returning from evening classes at the same community center, had reported an attempted abduction. The suspect, a local man with a transient criminal record, had been questioned and released due to insufficient evidence. No arrest was made, and the case had quietly faded from official records. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Both incidents involved women in the Brightmoor neighborhood, approaching or leaving familiar locations at night. Both suspects drove panel vans, and both victims narrowly escaped or, in Grace's tragic case, did not. The prior event offered a haunting possibility. The same individual might have been testing the environment, observing patterns, and learning how far they could act without consequence. Detectives revisited the 1,983 files, seeking overlooked details. Sparse notes suggested the suspect had intimate knowledge of Detroit's industrial backroads, routes rarely patrolled by police. Yet, despite the tantalizing connections, the evidence remained circumstantial. Without definitive proof, the lead remained a shadow, a thread that hinted at a larger pattern but could not, on its own, identify Grace's assailant. This link added both hope and frustration. It suggested that the perpetrator had a history, that their actions were not random. Yet it also underscored a chilling reality. Someone capable of planning an abduction had already evaded justice once, leaving the community and investigators powerless to prevent another tragedy. For the family, learning of the 1,983 attempted abduction introduced a bitter sense of inevitability. Grace's death, once perceived as an isolated misfortune, now seemed part of a calculated pattern. The knowledge deepened grief, frustration, and the urgent need for answers that would not come for decades. By the end of these early investigative efforts, a profound sense of exhaustion had settled over the case. Each lead, each suspect, and each untraceable sighting of the van reinforced the detectives' growing frustration. Kozlowski and his team had chased shadows for months, their meticulous efforts stymied at every turn. What should have been a straightforward path to justice had become a maze of obstacles, dead ends, and uncertainty. For Grace's family, the emotional toll was staggering. Marcus Holloway endured sleepless nights, haunted by the thought that the person responsible for taking Grace had walked freely in their neighborhood. Patricia Williams Bennett carried a blend of sorrow and anger, determined that her sister's absence would not go unnoticed. Yet grappling with the helplessness of decades spent without answers, the community, too, felt the ripple of unease. A beautiful young teacher had vanished, and the system seemed powerless to intervene. The unresolved nature of the case left a lingering tension, a sense that justice was suspended in time. Each failure in the investigation heightened the stakes, making it painfully clear that the perpetrator remained unpunished and potentially observing the world they had disrupted. The unresolved questions who followed Grace, why she was taken, and how her killer had evaded detection gnawed at everyone involved. This culmination of dead ends, false leads, and emotional strain set the stage for the eventual revival of the case decades later. The foundation was laid, a victim whose life was cut short, an investigation hampered by limitations, and a community desperate for closure. If this injustice strikes you as intolerable, don't sit silently. Subscribe now and witness the relentless pursuit of truth. And if you choose not to, leave a comment explaining why you would ignore a story that could change everything you thought you knew about safety and justice. In 2024, the Detroit Police Department received federal funding earmarked for re-evaluating decades-old unsolved cases. Among the files dusted off and scrutinized, the case of Grace Williams immediately captured attention. Lieutenant Vanessa Morrison, an investigator specializing in cold cases and genetic genealogy, was assigned to lead the review. The file itself was unusually detailed. Evidence from the 1,984 investigation had been preserved with care. Grace's clothing, fibers, nail scrapings, and trace elements from her abandoned Cavalier. Morrison recognized the potential of modern forensic technology to breathe life into these decades-old leads. While the original investigation had relied on traditional methods, the new era offered possibilities that her predecessors could never have imagined. DNA phenotyping, advanced sequencing, and genealogical databases provided a chance to finally identify the person responsible. For the first time, hope threaded through the case that had long been a source of grief for Grace's family. The detective reviewed Kozlowski's notes and the painstakingly logged evidence. Every detail mattered. Each fiber, every witness account, and even the van sightings were reanalyzed with fresh eyes. The old maps plotting Grace's last known locations, community center, abandoned automotive plant, and Rouge Park, were scanned digitally to identify patterns that might have been invisible in 1984. The meticulous organization of the original investigators, once overlooked, became the foundation for renewed momentum. Morrison's approach blended patience with precision. She understood that the breakthrough might not come quickly, but that the tools now available could finally resolve what had eluded law enforcement for 40 years. Each preserved item held the potential to illuminate the past, to finally give Grace Williams' family the answers they had been denied for decades. Imagine a killer walking free for decades while families suffer. Are you going to watch silently? Subscribe now, or admit in the comments why you'd rather turn a blind eye. Morrison immediately contacted Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in DNA phenotyping and genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional DNA testing, which could only identify matches from direct samples, these new methods allowed investigators to reconstruct a suspect's profile and identify distant relatives. Skin cells, once deemed useless after 40 years, could now reveal the identity of someone who had been hiding in plain sight. The process was painstaking but promising. Samples from Grace's fingernails collected during the 1985 autopsy were sent for analysis. These tiny remnants of DNA, collected while she struggled to survive her attacker, contained traces that had never been examined with the sensitivity of modern technology. Morrison coordinated closely with the lab, ensuring the chain of custody remained flawless. This technological edge brought both suspense and responsibility. Every fiber of evidence held the potential to finally identify the perpetrator. Each day without a breakthrough reminded Morrison and her team of the decades of grief endured by Marcus Holloway, Patricia Williams Bennett, and the Detroit community. The pressure was immense. Failure was not an option. The team also revisited every detail from the 1984 investigation with the technology in mind. Witness statements, van sightings, and the mapped routes Grace may have taken were re-evaluated. The goal was clear. Combine modern science with historical data to illuminate a path that had been obscured for 40 years. Lieutenant Morrison began the painstaking review of the preserved evidence, understanding that every small detail could lead to a breakthrough. Grace's clothing, carefully stored since 1984, revealed fibers that hinted at industrial carpeting, traces of motor oil, and minute skin cells under her fingernails. While investigators at the time could do little more than catalog these materials, Morrison saw their potential as keys to identifying her attacker. She mapped each piece of evidence against the known timeline. The community center, the abandoned automotive plant, and the eventual dump site in Rouge Park. The triangulation suggested someone familiar with the industrial zones of Detroit, someone who knew which areas were rarely patrolled. The dark van, reported by witnesses, became more than an anecdote. It was now a clue connected to a larger network of possible suspects. Morrison also revisited witness accounts, cross-referencing their statements with city records and traffic patterns from 1984. Douglas Perth and Kevin Tatum, the two witnesses who had reported seeing the van, were re-interviewed. Their recollections, once considered vague, now gained weight when combined with modern analytical techniques. Even the smallest discrepancies were examined for potential significance. Through this meticulous process, Morrison's team began to narrow the scope. Each elimination brought them closer to uncovering a pattern, one that had remained invisible for decades. The blend of historical detective work with cutting-edge technology instilled a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in 40 years, the possibility of closure felt tangible. The atmosphere in the cold case unit shifted. Hope replaced the lingering frustration, and the lingering frustration and determination intensified. Every trace of Grace's struggle was now a potential link to her attacker, and Morrison knew that patience, precision, and perseverance could finally bring a name to the face that had haunted her community for generations. Recognizing the complexity of the case, Lieutenant Vanessa Morrison assembled a specialized team. Each member brought a unique skill set. Forensic analysts, adept at extracting degraded DNA. Genealogists, experienced in building family trees from distant relatives, and investigators skilled at piecing together decades-old witness statements. Morrison emphasized collaboration, knowing that the combined expertise could unlock what 40 years of standard investigation had failed to achieve. The team reviewed every artifact linked to Grace Williams: clothing fibers, trace elements from the abandoned automotive plant, and the skin cells beneath Grace's fingernails were catalogued again, this time for analysis with cutting-edge techniques. They knew that the smallest fragment could provide a genetic profile capable of identifying a suspect and bringing decades of anguish to a close. Alongside laboratory work, the team reanalyzed all documented movements of Grace on the night she disappeared. Maps were overlaid with new data points. The van sightings, ice-coated roads, and patterns of industrial activity in Brightmoor. Even minor details, once thought insignificant, were now scrutinized for connections. Each observation was an opportunity to reconstruct the final hours of Grace's life with accuracy never previously possible. The collaborative effort created a sense of urgency and hope. Morrison frequently reminded her team that they were not only solving a decades-old murder, but also providing long-awaited closure to a grieving family. Every fiber of evidence, every record, and every DNA sample carried the weight of 40 years of loss, and the team approached the case with a blend of precision and empathy. Suspense grew as the first batch of DNA samples was prepared for analysis. For the first time in decades, the possibility of identifying Grace's killer felt within reach. The community's nightmare, frozen in time since 1984, was beginning to thaw under the careful attention of Morrison and her team. By mid-2024, Morrison's team had completed the initial rounds of DNA extraction and forensic analysis. The technology at Parabon Nanolabs allowed them to retrieve genetic material that had been invisible to investigators in 1985. Skin cells beneath Grace's fingernails, long overlooked, now held the potential to finally name her attacker. Every carefully bagged evidence item was handled with extreme caution. One misstep could compromise the decades-old trail of justice. The team meticulously cross-referenced the emerging genetic data against genealogical databases. Algorithms began identifying distant relatives, tracing potential family lines that could eventually lead to the suspect. Each lead was a thread, fragile but promising, requiring precise verification before being pursued further. Morrison knew patience was critical. One wrong assumption could derail the case entirely, and 42 years of waiting had already taught the dangers of premature conclusions. While the lab worked, investigators reviewed every previous dead end. The 1,983 attempted abduction, the van sightings, and the industrial knowledge of the abduction site were all re-examined with a sharper eye. Patterns that were previously dismissed began to make sense. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered and incomplete, were slowly beginning to align. Morrison could sense that they were on the verge of something monumental. For decades, Grace Williams's family had endured unimaginable grief, and the community had carried the memory of her disappearance like an unhealed wound. Now, for the first time, the evidence was pointing toward resolution. Imagine a killer walking free for decades, while families suffer. Are you going to watch silently? Subscribe now, or admit in the comments why you'd rather turn a blind eye. At Parabon Nanolabs, scientists handled the 42-year-old evidence with extreme care. Skin cells under Grace Williams' fingernails, once overlooked as minor remnants of her struggle, became the most critical piece of the puzzle. In 1985, the technology to retrieve meaningful DNA from such fragile samples did not exist. The cells had degraded over decades, exposed to cold, moisture, and the passage of time, making them almost invisible to the methods of the past. Modern forensic techniques allowed the team to amplify even minute fragments of genetic material. Specialized enzymes and chemical processes were applied to carefully separate Grace's DNA from contaminants. Each step was painstaking. Any contamination or error could erase the chance to finally name her attacker. The lab hummed with quiet intensity as the team monitored every phase of extraction, knowing that decades of unanswered questions and unimaginable grief rested on their success. Morrison received constant updates as the DNA began to form a usable profile. The once invisible evidence gradually transformed into a comprehensive genetic blueprint. It contained markers unique to Grace's attacker, the very fingerprints of the person who had ended her life. For the first time in over 40 years, the possibility of identifying a suspect was no longer theoretical. Every member of the team understood the stakes. This was more than a scientific achievement. It was a step toward delivering justice to a family that had endured a lifetime of waiting. With the DNA successfully extracted, the next phase would take them from the lab to the genealogical databases, where the hidden connections within human families could finally illuminate a decades-old crime. With a complete DNA profile in hand, Morrison's team moved to the next stage, genealogical analysis. The extracted genetic material was uploaded into specialized ancestry and forensic genealogy databases, systems designed to identify familial connections that conventional law enforcement methods could never uncover. Even a distant relative's profile could act as a breadcrumb, leading investigators closer to the suspect. The process required patience and precision. Algorithms scanned millions of profiles, searching for shared segments of DNA that indicated familial ties. Each potential match was carefully catalogued, with attention to age, gender, and location. These distant relatives, some unaware they had provided data for criminal investigations, became the unexpected keys to solving a decades-old murder. Investigators began building family trees based on these connections. Morrison coordinated with genealogists who traced lineage back through multiple generations, mapping out extended families, marriages, and offspring. Every link narrowed the pool of possibilities, while also revealing geographic patterns that aligned with the original crime scene. Each confirmation of a distant cousin strengthened confidence that the DNA truly belonged to the killer. Anticipation grew in the team. For decades, Grace Williams' disappearance had been a haunting void in Detroit's history, a mystery that frustrated generations of detectives. Now, with technological precision, that void began to shrink. Each potential relative illuminated paths the investigation could follow, transforming a cold, unsolvable case into a methodical pursuit of truth. The air in Morrison's office was taut with focus. Every new match carried the weight of decades of grief, unanswered questions, and the potential for closure. The team knew that within this network of DNA connections, the identity of Grace's killer waited hidden in plain sight until now. With the initial DNA matches in hand, investigators shifted from raw data to human connections. Each distant cousin became a point on a sprawling family tree, a line tracing back decades through Detroit and surrounding areas. Genealogists meticulously traced marriages, births, and deaths, seeking links that might indicate a male relative fitting the profile of Grace Williams' attacker in 1984. Morrison's team cross-referenced locations, ages, and occupations to eliminate individuals who could not have been present in Detroit at the time. Records from city directories, employment files, and neighborhood registries helped narrow the search. The painstaking work slowly reduced the sprawling web of distant relatives into smaller, more manageable branches, each with potential links to a suspect. Every step involved careful verification. A single mistake could send the investigation down a dead end, wasting precious time and resources. Investigators verified each connection multiple times, consulting census records and historical documents. By systematically eliminating those who could not plausibly match the circumstances, the team began to see patterns emerge. lines of descent that intersected with areas Grace had traveled in her final hours. Suspense built within the team as the circle of potential suspects tightened. Each new revelation increased the probability that the right person could be identified. The combination of DNA science and historical detective work transformed decades-old evidence into actionable intelligence. For the first time in 42 years, the case had direction. Grace Williams' killer was no longer a faceless shadow lurking in history. He existed within these carefully mapped family lines, a man whose life intersected with hers in that fateful December night. Morrison and her team were closing in, step by step, as the long-sought breakthrough in the case drew nearer. With the family trees constructed, Morrison's team began systematically eliminating individuals who could not match the parameters of the 1,984 crime. Age, location, employment, and gender became critical factors. Only males living in Detroit in 1984, within driving distance of Brightmoor, and within the age range of 25 to 45, remained under consideration. Investigators reviewed historical employment records, discovering where each potential suspect worked at the time. They mapped routes, estimated travel times, and considered the logistics of committing the crime and concealing Grace Williams' body. Even minor discrepancies in timelines or locations were enough to remove a name from the list. Slowly, the pool of potential perpetrators shrank from dozens to 10, then 5, and finally 3 individuals. The process was both technical and tense. Every decision carried enormous weight. Morrison knew that a single miscalculation could delay justice yet another year, or worse, result in the wrong person being accused. Interviews with living relatives provided further insight into each suspect's history, habits, and character. Small details, a prior complaint, a past run-in with law enforcement, a known connection to Brightmoor became significant markers. As the team moved closer to identifying the killer, the atmosphere was a mix of caution and anticipation. After 4 decades of uncertainty, a breakthrough was within reach. The DNA, once isolated from Grace's fingernails, had guided them through the tangled web of family connections to a short list of plausible suspects. Morrison's team knew that one of these men had lived a normal, unsuspected life for 42 years. The very thought sent a shiver through the room. Grace's killer had walked among friends and neighbors, invisible yet so close. The next steps would finally reveal which of these 3 men had caused decades of grief and heartbreak. The decisive moment arrived when Morrison's team zeroed in on one individual whose profile aligned with every critical factor. Dale Pritchard, 68 inches, 2024, emerged from the family tree as a former Detroit resident. The right age, in 1984, and fitting the geographic and occupational patterns investigators had meticulously charted. His name alone sent a ripple through the team. After decades of dead ends, they had a tangible lead. To confirm suspicions, the team conducted covert surveillance and collected discarded items to obtain DNA without alerting him. A coffee cup, casually left on the curb, became the key to unlocking the truth. Laboratory analysis returned results that were conclusive, a 99.9999% match to the DNA extracted from Grace's fingernails. 42 years of uncertainty, grief, and unanswered questions were about to reach resolution. The room filled with a mix of relief, tension, and disbelief. Morrison understood the gravity of the breakthrough. Grace's killer had been living freely among neighbors, attending barbecues, coaching children, and volunteering. No one could have suspected the darkness hidden in plain sight. This revelation transformed the investigation from theoretical to immediate, urgent, and tangible. Investigators prepared for the next phase, building a case strong enough to withstand legal scrutiny while managing the community's anticipation. Every detail from the 1,984 case now had context, and each clue collected decades ago would play a critical role in securing justice. For the first time in over 40 years, hope surged. The relentless pursuit, combining genetic science with traditional detective work, had pinpointed the man responsible for a crime that had haunted Detroit. Grace Williams's story was nearing a turning point, the moment when a killer who had walked free for decades would finally be confronted with the truth. Dale Pritchard lived a life that, on the surface, appeared ordinary, even admirable. By 2024, he was a 6'8" man, residing in Warren, Michigan, a mere 12 miles from the heart of Detroit, where Grace Williams had vanished decades earlier. Neighbors knew him as the man who mowed his lawn every Sunday without fail, attended church services with his family, and never missed a local baseball game for the children he coached. He was a volunteer at church fundraisers, always willing to help fix a neighbor's broken fence or lend tools to anyone in need. To the casual observer, he embodied stability, kindness, and civic responsibility. Yet, for those following the cold case investigation, these daily acts of normalcy only intensified the unease. Here was a man whose outward life gave no hint of the horror tied to his name, a person who had gone unnoticed for over 4 decades, despite standing just blocks away from the community where Grace had lived and worked. Every handshake, every friendly smile, every perfectly mundane morning he walked past the grocery store or post office concealed the truth that investigators were now beginning to uncover. The contrast was chilling. A man who seemed entirely integrated into the social fabric of his neighborhood, yet whose past held the key to one of Detroit's most haunting, unresolved murders. Detectives realized that the ordinary details of his life, his predictable routine, familiar routes, and trusted reputation were precisely what allowed him to remain undetected for so long. The audience begins to feel the creeping tension. Someone capable of horrific violence had worn the mask of the community's most dependable neighbor for decades, and only the convergence of modern forensic science and relentless detective work could reveal the hidden story. Long before the DNA breakthrough, Dale Pritchard had briefly crossed paths with law enforcement in 1983. A year before Grace Williams vanished, a young woman reported an attempted abduction near St. Michael's Community Center, the same place Grace would later frequent. Pritchard, then 25, was questioned by Detroit detectives, his name recorded, his responses scrutinized. Yet the encounter yielded no concrete evidence. The woman could not positively identify him, and with no physical proof linking him to the attempted crime, investigators were forced to release him. To the outside world, it appeared to be an inconclusive incident. Just another thread in a city overwhelmed by rising crime. But in hindsight, it was a warning sign, a shadow hinting at the violent potential lurking behind a seemingly ordinary life. For decades, the case file sat dormant, catalogued but largely forgotten, as Pritchard continued his routine, unnoticed and unchallenged. This prior encounter underscored a chilling reality. Someone capable of planning and executing abduction had already tested the boundaries of the law without consequence. It was a missed opportunity that haunted detectives revisiting the Grace Williams case 40 years later. Every detail, every small clue from that 1,983 report became a thread investigators could now pull, revealing connections that had previously gone unrecognized. For the audience, the unease deepens. A man questioned for attempted violence not only evaded justice once, but would also go on to commit a murder that remained unresolved for decades. The contrast between his normal life and this earlier warning amplifies suspense, making the eventual revelation of his culpability all the more shocking. Dale Pritchard's daily life in Brightmoor provided him with both proximity and opportunity. In 1984, he worked night shifts as a maintenance supervisor at Chrysler's Jefferson Avenue assembly plant, just a few miles from where Grace Williams had lived and volunteered. His brown Dodge van, part of his job duties, allowed him to traverse industrial areas with ease, moving through zones that many residents avoided after dark. It was the perfect vehicle for blending into the urban landscape, unremarkable to casual observers, yet enabling him to trail a target unnoticed. Investigators later realized that the triangle, formed by Grace's last known locations, the community center, her abandoned car at the automotive plant, and the body dump site in Rouge Park, was no accident. It indicated someone familiar with Detroit's industrial layout, someone who understood which streets were rarely patrolled and which paths could be used to conceal illicit activities. Pritchard's professional knowledge of plant facilities, storage areas, and access routes gave him an advantage that no ordinary perpetrator would have had. The revelation of his movements in 1984 created a chilling pattern. Every step of his daily and nightly routine aligned with the timeline of Grace's disappearance. He was often in the vicinity, maintaining the facade of an ordinary worker while positioning himself to act when the opportunity presented itself. The combination of trustworthiness, community respect, and occupational mobility allowed him to move undetected, a stark reminder of how someone seemingly ordinary could exploit familiarity to commit extraordinary violence. For the audience, the tension mounts. The man who had once been dismissed as just another neighbor had all the pieces in place to commit a crime that would haunt Detroit for decades. Each ordinary detail now carries a weight of dread, demonstrating how opportunity and proximity intersected with a dangerous, hidden intent. To neighbors and colleagues, Dale Pritchard was the picture of respectability. He coached youth baseball, volunteered at church fundraisers, and was known for lending a hand with home repairs. He attended community barbecues, celebrated milestones with friends, and even earned the trust of local families. Children adored him. Parents trusted him. In every interaction, he appeared to be a model citizen, a man whose life revolved around community and family. But behind this ordinary exterior lay a hidden history few could have imagined. His brief 1,983 encounter with law enforcement over the attempted abduction hinted at violent impulses that went unnoticed. That single incident, once dismissed, now appeared to foreshadow the actions that would later take Grace Williams' life. Pritchard had spent decades concealing his capacity for calculated violence beneath layers of charm and civility. The contrast between the man everyone admired and the man capable of murder created a stark, unsettling tension. Investigators examining the 1,984 timeline were struck by the chilling duality. Pritchard's routine life, coaching, volunteering, attending community events, masked a capacity for premeditated crime. It was a reminder that appearances could be deceptive, that someone capable of extreme harm could simultaneously maintain a facade of normalcy. Each ordinary activity, once harmless, now seemed to align with the circumstances of Grace's disappearance, from his access to industrial zones to his vehicle use. For viewers, this dissonance is haunting. A man living openly among friends and family, trusted by all, was hiding decades of dangerous intent. It reinforces the uneasy question: how well do we truly know those around us? This duality sets the stage for the inevitable revelation, showing that danger can exist in the most familiar and trusted faces. The 12th of November 2024 arrived like any other chilly morning in Warren, Michigan, with temperatures hovering just above freezing. Neighbors went about their routines, unaware that the man they waved to, who had barbecued in their backyards and coached Little League, was about to be exposed for a crime that had haunted Detroit for 42 years. At 7:15 a.m., a team of Detroit police officers quietly approached Dale Pritchard's modest home, surveillance in place for days, waiting for the perfect moment to act. The covert DNA collection taken weeks prior had confirmed an undeniable match. The skin cells under Grace Williams's fingernails belonged to him. This proof eliminated doubt and hesitation. Justice, long delayed, was finally within reach. Officers knocked firmly on Pritchard's door, announcing their presence. The man, 68 now, but with a posture and composure reminiscent of his younger years, emerged in disbelief. His wife clutched her chest, screaming that there had been a mistake, but there was no room for error. The handcuffs clicked into place as the community, alerted by neighbors, slowly gathered, some whispering, some frozen in disbelief. The tension was immediate. How could someone so familiar, so seemingly ordinary, harbor the capacity to commit such violence? The police escorted Pritchard into a waiting vehicle, cameras discreetly recording every reaction. The neighborhood, once trusting and unassuming, now faced the shocking reality that a killer had lived among them for decades. For the audience, this moment is both climactic and jarring, a culmination of suspense built over 42 years. The arrest signifies more than procedural closure. It's the emotional pivot where disbelief, horror, and anticipation converge, signaling that the long-awaited confrontation with truth is finally underway. Can you imagine living next to a killer for decades without knowing? Don't ignore reality. Subscribe now, or admit in the comments that you'd rather stay in the dark. Inside a stark interrogation room at the Detroit Police Department, Dale Pritchard sat across from Lieutenant Vanessa Morrison and her team. The walls were bare, the overhead lights bright and unyielding, illuminating every detail of the man who had eluded justice for over 4 decades. His hands rested on the table, knuckles white, yet his expression was a mask of controlled composure, the same composure that had allowed him to live a normal life among friends, family, and neighbors. Morrison presented the evidence with precision. The DNA match was indisputable. Skin cells recovered from Grace Williams' fingernails had been identified and linked directly to him. Each word weighed heavily, each pause a calculated pressure point. The detectives detailed the timeline of Grace's last known movements, the abandoned plant, the van sightings, and the fibers found on her clothing. Pritchard's eyes, once calm, flickered with the first sign of recognition. He understood the trap had closed. The interrogation focused not only on the evidence but also on his behavior patterns, his seemingly ordinary routines, the community service, the coaching, all framed as a stark contrast to the calculated abduction he had committed decades earlier. Morrison's team asked carefully structured questions, probing for details of that night, for any cracks in his narrative. Every hesitation, every misstep was recorded, feeding the slow but inevitable unraveling of his story. For viewers, this is the moment tension reaches a peak. The audience senses that the decades-long mystery is finally at the tipping point. The dichotomy between Pritchard's outwardly normal life and the heinous crime he concealed creates a gripping psychological suspense. Every second in the room amplifies anticipation. Justice, long delayed, is finally within reach, and the confession that will follow promises to bring both closure and shock. After hours of questioning, Dale Pritchard's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The DNA evidence was irrefutable, and the detectives pressed steadily, piece by piece, connecting him to that freezing December night in 1984. His voice, initially measured, trembled as he recounted the events he had kept hidden for over 40 years. He described following Grace Williams after she left the community center, driving her off the icy streets and into the abandoned automotive plant where he and his accomplices operated an illegal chop shop. The details were precise. Her car, her confusion, the moment she realized she had stumbled upon something she wasn't meant to see. Pritchard admitted he had held her captive for 6 hours, deliberating what to do while she pleaded for her life. Her words, about her fiancé Marcus, her students, and their upcoming wedding, had no power to sway him. Finally, he confessed to strangling her with a garage rag, the act methodical, almost clinical, while his 2 associates watched. He revealed how they disposed of her body in Rouge Park and staged her car at the plant to mislead investigators. The horror of the act, contrasted with his decades of normal life barbecues, coaching, neighborhood trust, was a chilling reminder of the duality he maintained. For viewers, this confession is both devastating and cathartic. The suspense built over 42 years collapses into clarity. Every unanswered question, every lead that once seemed futile, now forms a complete, grim picture. The audience experiences the convergence of justice and disbelief. Pritchard's words bring closure to a story long frozen in time, yet the emotional weight of the crime remains unbearable. Word of Dale Pritchard's arrest and confession rippled through the Detroit community like a shockwave. Families, neighbors, and friends who had long interacted with him in everyday settings struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the killer revealed by DNA evidence. Whispers of disbelief turned into open conversations of outrage, betrayal, and grief. At the Williams household, Patricia Williams Bennett's hands shook as she read the arrest report. Decades of relentless advocacy, letters to authorities, and vigils for her sister had all been driven by the hope of this moment. Her voice cracked as she recounted memories of Grace, remembering her laughter, her kindness, and the life stolen from her. The revelation reignited grief, but it also offered a measure of vindication. Justice, though long delayed, had finally arrived. Marcus Holloway, now deceased, had carried the heartbreak silently for 42 years, and the weight of what he endured was felt profoundly by those who knew him. Friends and extended family expressed relief that the mystery tormenting their lives had concluded. But horror and anger lingered. For the community, Pritchard's arrest forced a reckoning with the idea that someone so ordinary could commit such calculated violence and evade justice for decades. Media coverage amplified the emotional intensity, broadcasting reactions from neighbors who had once welcomed him into their homes. Candlelight vigils were revisited in memory. The streets of Brightmoor, once filled with tension and sorrow, now buzzed with a complicated mixture of fear, relief, and disbelief. For viewers, this subsection underscores the human cost of long unsolved crimes. It emphasizes that delayed justice carries decades of emotional toll on families and communities, leaving them to wrestle with grief, trust, and fear. Following the confession, legal proceedings moved with deliberate care. On December 18, 2024, exactly 41 years after Grace Williams' death, Dale Pritchard was formally charged with first-degree murder. The courtroom, filled with family members, law enforcement, and community observers, became a stage where decades of grief, frustration, and hope converged. The prosecution presented irrefutable evidence. The DNA match, linking Pritchard to Grace, the detailed account of her abduction and murder, and corroboration from investigative notes preserved from the original 1984 case. Witness testimonies reflected both the horror of the crime and the painstaking efforts of Detective Frank Kozlowski and Lieutenant Vanessa Morrison's team. Each exhibit, each statement, reminded the courtroom that a life had been stolen, and justice, though delayed, could now be sought. The defense attempted to challenge the age of the evidence and the reliability of memories after decades, yet the clarity of forensic technology and genetic genealogy left no room for doubt. Pritchard, once a respected neighbor and community figure, faced the full weight of the law. As the judge outlined potential sentencing, the family, law enforcement, and even the broader public felt a solemn sense of closure. This moment marked more than legal resolution. It was the end of uncertainty for Patricia Williams Bennett, who had fought tirelessly for recognition of her sister's case, and a reminder to the community that truth can emerge even after decades. It was a warning that crimes do not vanish with time, and that persistence and technology can bring even the most hidden offenders to account. Justice can be delayed, but if you ignore it, does that make you complicit in silence? Subscribe now, or leave a comment explaining why you'd rather stay unaware of the truth. After the arrest of Dale Pritchard in November 2024, the legal system moved to prepare for a trial that had been decades in the making. Prosecutors meticulously organized evidence: DNA linking Pritchard to Grace, witness statements, and records from the 1984 investigation. Court filings outlined charges of first-degree murder, abduction, and conspiracy with accomplices. For the Williams family, the formal charges brought a complex mixture of relief and sorrow. Patricia Williams Bennett, who had dedicated her life to advocating for victims' rights, attended every procedural meeting. She reviewed evidence, coordinated with prosecutors, and prepared statements for media coverage, ensuring that Grace's story would be heard fully. The community followed closely, many remembering the chilling news of Grace's disappearance as children or young adults. Trial preparation was exhaustive. Defense attorneys attempted to challenge the age and integrity of decades-old evidence, but modern forensic science, combined with well-documented investigative work, made their arguments weak. Each meeting, each filing, reminded everyone involved that the stakes were not only legal but profoundly human. Justice, though delayed, was approaching. News of Pritchard's trial reverberated across Detroit. Local media covered the arrest and charges extensively, interviewing former neighbors, classmates, and colleagues of Grace. Candlelight vigils were held in her memory, attended by those who had never stopped hoping for answers. The streets of Brightmoor, once haunted by fear and uncertainty, became a focal point for collective reflection. Community members expressed a mixture of anger, relief, and sorrow. Many remembered seeing Pritchard at church fundraisers or coaching Little League, unaware of the crime he had concealed. Conversations emerged about accountability, the importance of preserving evidence, and the power of modern forensic technology. Grace's story reminded everyone that even after decades, truth can surface, and justice can finally be pursued. Patricia Williams Bennett, alongside surviving family members, experienced an emotional reckoning. The decades of unanswered questions, grief, and frustration were finally met with resolution. Marcus Holloway, Grace's fiancé, had passed away in 2019, never able to see justice served, but the family's efforts ensured that Grace's story endured. Patricia continued her advocacy work, now armed with the proof that persistent pursuit could overcome decades of silence. Her speeches emphasized the importance of remembering victims as full lives lost, not mere headlines. Grace's memory was honored in classrooms, community centers, and local initiatives supporting missing persons. The resolution of Grace Williams' case offered a powerful moral. Justice can be delayed, but truth will find its way. The case highlighted the importance of perseverance, modern investigative methods, and the refusal to let a life vanish from public consciousness. Justice finally came, but imagine if this story had gone untold. Subscribe now to honor Grace's memory, or leave a comment confessing why you wouldn't want to witness the truth. The community, investigators, and family reflected on the fragile balance between time and accountability. Grace's life, her kindness, and her dedication to education became the lens through which closure was experienced. Though bittersweet, her story closed with recognition, remembrance, and a solemn promise. Delayed justice is still justice, and no life should be forgotten.